it's an area, it's an area that I still lack even basic understanding of what mental health disorders are, where they come from, what we can do to prevent them or overcome them in some way. Luckily today we have some experts from that field. Dr. Carlin Pleasance and Megan Harrison. Dr. Pleasance is a clinical psychologist who specializes in adult and adolescent psychotherapy. She's also the chief clinical advisor and a managing partner at A New Treatment Center in Scottsdale, Arizona. And Megan Harrison holds a master's degree in marriage and family therapy with significant experience working with families affected by transgenerational trauma and mental illness. And Megan is the CEO and managing partner at A New Treatment Center in Scottsdale. So, thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us.
It's great to meet you. I mentioned that sort of my introduction to psychology, I would say, was having Dr. Jordan Peterson on this podcast. And that's when I realized I just didn't understand at all what was going on and what it meant to have a mental health issue. And I realized when he was on the podcast, as he was talking through some of the problems that people have, I realized that the mind, well, this is my simple caveman way of translating what he was saying, was that your mind is like a car. And sometimes the car breaks down, or sometimes there's, you blow a gasket or your oil is low. And when that happens, you take it into a mechanic. And the mechanic diagnoses what the problem is. Oh, you blew a gasket. Here's what we need to do to fix it. And so I realized that in many ways, the mind can do that too. You can blow up a gasket, and there's people, psychologists or therapists, that can diagnose what the problem is and have methodologies and protocols to get those things fixed. So I again, in my caveman brain, realized that psychologists and therapists are like mind mechanics that have seen. That's what triggered it for me. That's what triggered that thought. Was he was telling me about, oh, I'd see this case, this type of case. He'd see it again, and he'd see it again, and he'd see it again, and you develop a protocol on how to deal with it. Just like, oh, your car's making this noise. Oh, okay, here's what the problem is, and you see that over and over again. You develop a protocol. So you two, welcome, and you two are mind mechanics, as far as I can tell. Let's talk about how you guys got here. Just a little bit of background, just so we get familiar with you. So let's start with you, Carlin. Where'd you grow up? How'd you end up in this scenario that you're in, sitting here right now?
Okay, let's see. Well, I grew up in the Bay Area, California. And one of the things I think is really funny about my story is I didn't understand how I got here until much, much later, looking back and trying to figure it out. For a very long time, I was one of those folks when people would say, so why did you go into psychology? Why did you become a psychologist? I would say things like, oh, I just like helping people. Mm-hmm. I'm a good listener. I'm interested in how the mind works, which are true things. But really going back and taking a more in-depth look at my journey, it started when I was a kid. I had some pretty serious physical limitations and physical illnesses that kept me out of school for a long time. I did not take a single PE class my entire scholastic career. Didn't get to participate the same way as other kids did. Missed a lot of things, was absent a lot of the time. And I remember being really young and thinking, like, is this it? Like, is this it? Can there be some other way of being, some other way of living? Because it was lonely. And as a kid, like that sense of feeling different, like I don't really belong.
How old were you when these health issues started? Was this like
I was diagnosed when I was two with like really severe respiratory and lung problems. And back then, I mean, we're talking early 70s, right? Like treatment was not as it is now. People didn't understand. I mean, my mom talks about how I was sick as an infant, and it took 2 years for a doctor to say, oh, I think I know what she has. Talk about a mechanic, right? She's taken me lots of mechanics over the years. And, treatments weren't as advanced as they are now. So growing up, all through, elementary school, junior high, high school, feeling very separate and different and not included, and knowing that people, thought I was kind of weird. How come you don't come to all the things? How come you don't take PE? How come you sit in on recess when we all go outside, right? Which, on one hand, doesn't sound. Whatever. It's the plight of a kid. But when I really look back and think about it, it was that sense of feeling alone and really misunderstood and not included in things, and wondering, like, there's got to be more. Like, this can't be it. This just cannot be it for me, for people. So early on, I remember thinking, when I grow up, like, I want to be a doctor. I want to be somebody who basically helps people like me. Again, in a young brain, thinking, well, if I feel like this, probably everybody feels like this. And I don't want people to feel like this, so maybe I'll help kids, or I'll help people with respiratory problems, or I'll help people with medical illnesses. And it just kind of developed that way, this idea of wanting to, I don't know, in some way help ease the suffering that other people experience, and make sense of what was going on. Now, again, I don't remember it like this at the time. In my mind, I just wanted to help people.
So did you apply yourself at school? Were you like, I need to get straight A's so I can be a doctor?
I was like, yeah, so overachieving. For what I couldn't do over here, I made up for it way over here. So lots of good grades, lots of degrees, lots of academic awards.
Did you go to school with the intent of becoming a doctor? At what point did you think psychology was the place to go?
For a while, I wanted to go into medical doctor, and then when I learned that you have to take a class called anatomy and look at bodies, I thought, yeah, this might not be for me.
Like you were squeamish?
Totally squeamish. So I'm like, yeah, I don't know if that's then going to work out for me very well to go that direction. But it also, again, the insight of this came through hindsight. Is I was so curious about really the mental part of it, right? The experience of feeling isolated and disconnected, and how that left you feeling, or me feeling, like lonely and depressed and kind of like wanting more, right? So I got a little bit more curious in the like psychological department of what happens for people who have an illness, what happens for people who feel separate and different from everybody else, who are left out, who are bullied, like what happens psychologically. So I definitely made a turn along the way.
And was that in college?
I would say maybe high school-ish, going into college. Just kind of a fascination with how the mind works, and in some ways, unlike going to a mechanic, a lot of the psychological experiences that a person might have in reaction or relation to all of these different events, you don't see them. Like, we can go into a doctor and take a listen to your head and go, oh, I recognize that clicking. I know exactly what to do. There are these kind of invisible, unseen experiences that make it a little bit more challenging to figure out or understand what exactly is going on. So that curiosity, I just remember high school, probably going into college, just curious, like, how does this work? Like, why do I feel this way? But this person I met also had an illness when she was young, and she seems to be okay. Like, why did I suffer? Or why was I okay over here, but this guy couldn't do grades, so this kind of curiosity about how the mind influences the experiences. And I remember sitting I was probably getting close to getting my first degree, and in a kind of a pathology class, kind of a mental illness class on mental illness and the pathology of illness. The professor said, show of hands, how many in here believe that you're in here to help people? You just want to do good in the world. The good student, me, along with most of the other class. And he's like, okay, how many of you in here think that you have chosen this field or chosen this part of the field because you've got your own stuff you might need to work out? Everyone's like, not me, not a hand, or maybe like half hand. And by the end of that class, it was the reverse. Everybody was like, yep, I've got my own stuff. I need to work out. That's partly why I'm here. Right? So that started I think the kind of budding awareness that this isn't just about, for me, it wasn't just about helping people and being a good listener, but it was about understanding myself and hopefully through the process, being able to take that experience and help other people, whether that's not feel so alone or understand that there are options available or that this isn't kind of the fate of your life because you have this illness or this experience. So yeah, I definitely have swung from here, like I'm just really altruistic, all the way over here to, no, life is hard sometimes. Life is really hard. And when you factor in, like my experience growing up with an illness, also growing up in a family where there were a lot of issues, and not just in my immediate family, but generational. You and I, Megan, have talked about this, of trauma and addiction and loss and wartime. Like you kind of inherit a little bit of that along the way. So my curiosity over time, expanded beyond just my own experience. But how does this happen in families? How does this happen through generations? How do you find, we had a client we saw at the treatment center for a long time who had schizophrenia, 2 siblings, a sister who did not have schizophrenia, a brother who did. Parents were really, really lovely, great people, did not seem to have a lot of stuff going on, but the dad's brother, the dad had 3 brothers, he was one of 4, all 3 of them had schizophrenia. So this idea, right, of like, okay, some of this is passing down through generations, not just at a genetic level, but what you're exposed to and what you're seeing and what you're experiencing and what you're witnessing. So again, for me, the curiosity and the interest was about, how do these things happen? How do they go from here to here to here to here? And what can we do to shift that so people aren't just kind of living out this emotional inheritance or this traumatic inheritance, depending on what was going on in the family? How do you break that chain? How do you do something different? How do you set your own life up to go in a different trajectory than maybe how it's been going, and then your kids and their kids and their kids? So
yeah, it makes sense that like if you were going to get a personal trainer because you want to get in shape, it would be kind of, if you saw that personal trainer had gone through some sort of transition themselves, you go, oh, okay, this person kind of knows what I've been through. So you kind of got that vibe. I can say vibe a lot, so you got to forgive me.
I do too. It's okay.
You kind of have that vibe. So what degrees did you end up with? What'd you end up with? You said you got like degree upon degree.
Yeah.
So what'd you end up with?
So I got a bachelor's degree in psychology, which unfortunately in our field nowadays that doesn't mean a whole lot other than you went to school for a few years and learned a bunch of things about the brain. Got my master's in counseling, also in California, and then got my doctorate in clinical psychology down here in San Diego.
Got it. All right. Megan,
Yes.
let's talk about you. Where'd you grow up? How'd you end up here?
Sure. Feels like a big question. I grew up in southern Wisconsin, really small town, beautiful there. Not much to do in that area. You're probably fishing,
What'd your parents
hunting. My dad owned a chain of grocery stores, and my mom worked just cleaning houses and working for my uncle's scrap metal business, whatever we could do. And my dad that I'm speaking to came later on in life as well with like the chain of grocery stores. So the first part of my life was just me and mom. And so she taught me definitely hard work, but there wasn't much to do where I grew up. You were bowling, curling, fishing, hunting, or going to the bar. That was about it.
Curling.
Yes.
Curling just made the podcast. We're 352 podcasts deep, and we just got into curling.
It's a big deal in Wisconsin, let me tell you. It's very cold for about 8 months out of the year. So, yeah, I mean, my story, I was born into a family system that had definitely been impacted by just generations of trauma. Abuse, addiction, mental health issues on the very severe end. And similar to what Carlin is saying, I don't know that like sitting here right now, like the only intentionality in that for me and coming into this therapy world was just this idea that through life, every step I took forward in terms of overcoming just brought me further into the life that I envisioned for myself. And that was sort of my intention in that way. But I knew growing up in that environment that there was no way I was going to be able to do something different for myself or do something different for the family I wanted to have if I stayed there. And so from a very young age, I sort of started my path towards independence. I started working at a very young age. The military sort of came into my life as this idea of like, here's an opportunity to go somewhere, to do something. I actually was finishing some high school stuff at a community college and was watching the September 11th occurrences in 2001, and I just remember looking at the screen and being like, oh, this is what I'm going to do. I had entertained the military for a period of time, and I had thought maybe this was my opportunity, but it was in that moment that I was like, okay, like this, I feel a sense of purpose, like drawn to something. And in the environment that I grew up in, I kind of always knew that I wanted something different for myself, but I lacked a lot of direction and people in my life to kind of help me guide in that way. Education wasn't particularly valued or seen as like a possibility. And at that point in my life, I hadn't had enough experiences other than just like surviving in a lot of ways to see that as possible for myself, to see ready to like go to school and do that route. And so the military just felt like okay, this is what I'm going to go do, and there's like something really important that's happening. I need to go do it. And it was about a year later, August of 2002, that I was on active duty. And
What'd you join?
I joined the Navy.
How'd you pick that? Being in Wisconsin.
You know, it's really interesting. I think it had to do with the recruiter at the time, because I was definitely a youth that was, getting, some help from the community and different things. And at that time in the Midwest, recruiters would come into those areas and introduce themselves and such. And so I just remember him as being somebody that I was like, okay, like he seems confident. Like the way he carries himself, like this is like something I want to be a part of. And it sort of seems cliche, but at the time it was everything for me, because I didn't, the friends that I had at the time, and I had, been living with friends at a very young age and such, like weren't really going a lot of places. Jail, I lost a lot of friends to, death, suicide, overdoses. There was just a lot of that in my life. And so just being around somebody who just sort of represented like a possibly different future and like life was huge for me. It was like a role model, mentor. So I joined.
What job did you sign up for?
So I came in as a signalman, and that's what I went to A school for, but I dates myself a little bit because it was already kind of like a dying rate at the time. So I went to A school to be a signalman, and my first orders were actually to the USS Kitty Hawk in Japan at the time, and I was set to leave about a week later, and my orders got canceled because there wasn't enough berthing for females at the time, and I was rerouted to ACB-1 in San Diego. And I got there, and I was getting issued camis and boots, and like we were getting ready to deploy to Kuwait, because this was like this was like latter part of 2002, so we were like getting ready to go overseas for everything that was happening during Operation Enduring Freedom and during that time. And so I was like, what did I just get myself into? Because I thought I was going to a ship, and then here I am in like a whole different world. As I'm sure you're familiar, the CVs are just a whole different realm and such. And so, but it was such a blessing for me, because it was like a form of reparenting. Like the amount of structure that I went into, I knew exactly what was expected of me. And it was also the first time that I learned how much, I think because of the environment I grew up in, that I thrive in crisis in some ways. Like things get crazy, something's happening, everything for me just kind of calms down, and I wanted to lead, and I found myself in a lot of leadership positions. I found myself an opportunity like volunteer for this, volunteer for that, I'll do it. And it really gave me the opportunity to just build a sense of self for the first time. The community, the feedback that I was getting was just huge for me. And then all kinds of doors opened up for me. The idea of like, I could go to school, I could do this. My first interest in doing some counseling such actually came from, I thought originally I was gonna go to school to be, to do organizational psychology for leadership. Like that was really my goal. I always wanted to be a leader. For me,
Is this before you joined the Navy or once you got in?
Once I got in, I was just kind of drawn into these situations where I knew that there was like I don't know if you want to call it a natural leadership quality, but there was just like this part of me that I had gone through so much and I had overcome so much that it was like people need that, you know, to like hear that story, to be a part of that. Like it just, it was a really powerful thing for me. And I was realizing for other people as well at the time. And so I got offered an opportunity to do some work with families in pre and post-deployment sort of support. And it was very logistical at the time. How do you support families in like, you know, preparing for the logistics of bills or separation or what's going on. But what I realized at that time was that there was a significant amount of support that these families needed, and understand like how much role shifts were happening when one of the partners would deploy, and then I'm making this new group of friends while my husband or my wife is gone, and they're making their new group of friends, and our kids are getting used to me as playing like both mom and dad and doing these different roles, and they just did not have the resources to be able to deal with that. And I think because I had gone through what I did as a child, I could recognize things related to like mental health or relationship issues or things like that. I didn't really have the skill set yet to know exactly what to do with that, other than just my mindset was always like, you just do keep moving forward and one step at a time, and you make healthy decisions, and you recognize that, you know, I don't exist in a vacuum, and the things I do matter, and how I treat people matter, and I could support people a lot with that. But it was that was what first drew me to the idea of counseling. And at the time, I was working. When I decided to go to school for counseling, I was working as a contractor for HSC3. So this was after.
So how long did you end up doing in the Navy?
So I did 5 years. So I did 4 years on active duty, and then I extended for a year.
How was that first deployment to Kuwait?
It was intense. You know, we were at the Kuwaiti Naval Base. We came in during a time where really nothing was set up. Our goal is that being the CBs there, ACB1 and ACB2 were there at the same time. So when we got there, we knew we're not leaving for a while.
Props to the CBs, by the way.
Yes.
CBs are awesome.
Yes, they definitely are, and definitely make friends with builders, because your camp will be real nice.
Yeah.
And you'll get a nice little shelf up there,
Yeah.
and all the things that you need.
And
So
they'll steal you whatever you need, which no one wants to talk about. But you're gonna
I learned how to be very resourceful. There was also some aspects of being in the military as a female in that type of environment, and a lot of things that were going on during that time that made it a scary situation sometimes too. You want to feel safe in that environment, but there was, you know, you're in the middle of the desert, and people are going through wartime, and we had, you know, incoming missiles coming in. We're running, you know, Taconics boxes that are buried in the ground for like shelter. Like people were on edge during that time for sure. And so, but I learned a lot, and if anything, it was walking away from that knowing that I could, you know, it doesn't matter what life throws at you. If you just keep moving forward, like you get through it for sure. So.
If I can interrupt, I remember you telling a story one time, Megan, about like having to dig holes to sleep in the ground, and having like your gun there because of like how big the scorpions were.
Oh,
And like having to protect yourself and guard yourself from the scorpions while you're in a hole in the desert at 127 degrees and you're like 19. Yeah, I think you can pretty much handle whatever is going to come your way in life. Holy moly.
But I mean, this is sort of that where you're talking about earlier, where one person can have one situation growing up and another can have an entirely different situation, and how you choose to respond is going to very much so shape the outcome of who you are. And so for me, I just, you know, there was a lot of opportunity to move into fear and have fear make you small. And for me, it was just like, I'm just going to keep going. But there wasn't, at that time in my life, I can't say, I mean, I was very young that I was intentionally like, this is what I'm doing to overcome, or that really wasn't there. For me, it just like stopping or not moving or going backwards wasn't an option. Just keep moving forward with whatever kind of presented itself to me. So, so yeah, I was there for a year, and actually didn't find out till the day before we were leaving that I was leaving. So it was like, you know, coming up to like, here's your plane ticket, you're leaving tomorrow. I'm like, cool.
Oh.
And at the time, you know, cell phones weren't allowed. We couldn't have any of that, and so there was 2 phones in the camp for a camp of. Gosh, don't quote me on this, but there was a lot of people. I mean, the Army was there.
I won't quote you on a lot of people being super specific like that.
The special operations, special forces were there. The Air Force was there. We had Australian, British, you know, military. It was a huge camp, Kuwaiti Naval Base, and so 2 phones for a large group of people would make the line very long that you're waiting. You could be standing there in hours, and then there'd be an incoming missile. Everybody'd have to run, go take, shelter, and then I gave up. So I didn't make any phones. And also for me, I was moving forward. I didn't have a whole lot of connections to the past, so I would just, yeah, that's what I did.
So you get done with your Navy career, you end up as a contractor, and so when did you end up going to school?
So that was when I was a contractor. I started with I actually went to school to be a pharmacy tech while I was still on active duty. I was, single mom at the time, and just raising my son and going to school at night and working during the day. And pharmacy tech seemed like a good option for me at the time to have a job when I got out. So I finished that before I got out. I started working at a compounding pharmacy and very quickly realized this is not what I want to do. Went back to school for my bachelor's in psychology, and then started working towards my master's in that contractor work. So my bachelor's and my master's all came after I had separated from the military. So I obtained my master's while I was working as a contractor, and was introduced for my practicum. So in counseling psychology, you have to do some pre-degree and post-degree hours, about a total of 3,000 direct and indirect clinical hours in order to obtain your degree. And so you get introduced to various treatment centers while you're in your school to get that experience and practice. And that was when I was actually introduced to Humble Chia, which was owned by Carrie and Carlin at the time. So a treatment center for clients with complex psychiatric disorders. And again, for me at the time, I was like, just sounds so interesting, family therapy and all of that. But in my mind, I was going to school because this was the school that I could do at night while I was commuting. I was commuting from Temecula down to Naval Air Station at the time. It was like 72 miles one way. And so I was just kind of moving through life, just doing the things that I thought I needed to do to move forward. And then I met Carrie and Carlin, and I came to know Humble Chia. And Humble Chia was just this really special place. It was like, I like to call it like a very much so all about like small business ownership and like what that means for our economy and such. But Carrie and Carlin they just owned this treatment center, and it was just a small family-owned place where like people just 100% threw themselves into helping these families. And I was drawn to it so much because the families that were walking through there were definitely the types of could have been my family, right? And here I was in this place where really beautiful things were happening in terms of supporting these people suffering through very severe things. I mean, when you have a loved one who has a chronic, complex psychiatric disorder, something that you're not getting rid of, right? We're like making friends with this. We're learning how to accept it, grieve what I thought was going to be for my kiddo, whatever it may be. When a family lets you into their life to like walk through that path with them, it is a very special thing. And I knew at that point, like, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to work with families. And when I started to realize, not only in my own life, but in what we were doing, that we were creating like generational change. Like when you can help a family system shift away from abuse or addiction or grief or in a way that allows them to envision a different identity for themselves. Like life could be different. Like we don't actually have to keep going in this way or continue these patterns. I mean, you think about the impact of that for years and years to come. We're talking about hundreds of people that could be impacted by one person choosing to do something different. That was like everything to me, and that's what I knew I wanted to do. And it's what I realized I was able to do for my family in a lot of ways. And then this sort of became my family when I was there. I was able to be seen in a different way. It was like, oh, we have this new leadership opportunity. Like, you do it. And I'm like, me?
And this is an interesting. This is the kind of the intersection between me and you two, which is, I got a group of friends, and we invest in a bunch of different things. And at one point, my buddy Joe said, "Hey, we're gonna invest in this. We're gonna buy some real estate. And it's gonna be used by this mental health facility." And I was like, cool. I mean, literally with them, they just kind of tell me they tell me a 3-minute. Hey, this is what we're putting money into. I say, cool, give them some money. We throw it in there. And at some point, we invested in sort of a branch of Humble Chia. And then that branch got swept into Humble Chia, and the whole thing got bought. And so you know, we it was a cool situation for us. You know, we made money and high-fived, and then that eventually rolled into this new venture, which is a new treatment center, which again, I mean, I'm just basically like I don't want to say a gambler, but a little bit of a gambler. Like, you're just letting money roll, you know, like, oh, just leave it on the table. And that's kind of what I did. And next thing you know, I'm invested in this new treatment center, and that's all starting to take place. And so that's kind of how we all know each other, was from that connection, you know, from me just kind of letting my money sit on the table and hope it keeps doing well. That's how we all know each other. But so thank you for your backgrounds. Definitely, I'm sure we could do a whole podcast about like each one of your stories, because there's a lot there. But I want to kind of get to the topic at hand, right? Which is me trying to get a better understanding of mental health issues. And you know, we were talking about before we hit record that just different things can hit people so differently. And two people can experience literally the same traumatic event and have totally different reactions. As you were talking, Megan, I was thinking that, like in SEAL training, the people that make it through SEAL training are so radically different. You've got a kid that grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth and he makes it through no problem. You got another kid that makes a silver spoon in his mouth and he quits the first day. You got someone that grew up on a farm in Iowa and he makes it through no problem, and someone else that grew up on a farm in Iowa and they quit the first day. And everyone in between. You got a kid from the ghetto that you know didn't have anything and he just makes it through. Some other kid from the ghetto, first day, I'm not putting up with this shit. And that's so these different lives can have just a radically different outcome. What are some of the main causes of mental health issues? Like, what is, and I know there must be several factors. I mean, there must be some that are hereditary. You kind of mentioned that, Carlin, like there are some hereditary things. Then there must be some things that are brought on by the environment that you grow up in or what you see. So what are some of the kind of main causes?
Well, there's so many. It's hard to narrow them down. And like I was saying earlier, so many of these things are they're unseen. They're invisible. They can't be like located so much on a map, so to speak. But things like temperament, you know, like the kind of the traits and characteristics that we're born with are going to play a role. Our upbringing, of course. Like, I'm thinking when you would share that story about being in Kuwait and I'm like, first of all, I would have never made it there. But like, I don't think I could have done that. Now, do I not have a tenacious personality or persevere? No, I've got some of that, but I think about my early upbringing, right? Where just living was hard. Digging a hole to like survive, that would have been at this whole other level for me. So my history, so people's histories, messages like in the family, like and this is my opinion.
What's a message? What does that mean? Like,
for example, I like to ask families or family members sometimes, so how did you guys do feelings? What were feelings like? Most of the time, you're going to have folks say, oh, we don't talk about feelings. we don't actually do feelings. Oh, okay. So when something difficult happens, you know, you get bullied at school, your boyfriend breaks up with you, grandma passes away. What did you guys do? Oh, nothing. We just had dinner, you know, right? So right here, right, there's something. A family that doesn't acknowledge feelings, talk about feelings, have a way to process what was happening is going to have a certain effect versus the family you ask and they're like, oh, we talked about feelings all the time. Anytime something happened, we'd sit down and have a big family meeting about it. That person is going to be shaped very differently in terms of managing stress and managing conflict and negotiating hardship, right? So family messages and family almost like traditions around things like feelings or how you handle hardship. I mean, the book I'm writing right now has a lot to do with the impact of secrets. So, and finding that has a big
what, like
impact.
Secrets in the family?
like we don't talk. Like if something happens, we're just not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about it amongst ourselves. We're not going to share this with the outside world. Under the rug, in the vault, whatever you want to call it. So you think about again, and it's not going to affect everybody the same way, but how easy it would be for a person then to develop, especially if they're young, this idea that like, oh, when bad things happen or when difficult things happen, you're not supposed to talk about that. You're supposed to keep it to yourself. Don't share. So what happens for those folks who are faced with something difficult or faced with a hard decision or faced with a stressful circumstance?
And then it's also so individual because someone can say, oh, you know, my grandma died and I'm looking at my dad and he looks stoic. That seems like a good thing to do. That seems like a good example, right?
Yes.
Or, oh, my grandma died and my dad looks stoic. He doesn't care. And so it's like your interpretation, people's individual interpretation. And even when you were talking, Megan, like when you joined the military or even you saw this recruiter and you kind of say, oh, this guy looks put together. And you get the military and you're like, okay, here's what I should be doing. And like your perception of what you're seeing and then your decision to say, oh, I can step up. I can volunteer for this. I can make this happen. Like just people's own interaction with reality and what's going on is so different. And is there a way that you can take people and show them the positive one? Does that work? Is that a thing to do? Like, let me give you an example. I have a kids podcast that I do sometimes, and I'll answer kids' questions because I've written a bunch of kids' books. And one of the questions I got one time was from a kid, and I've gotten multiple forms of this question. And this actually reminds me of you, Carlin. The question was like, I sometimes kids don't like to hang out with me, and I feel like I'm alone. How can I feel better about that?